Every once in a while, I receive comments from people asking if I have plans to review or share my updated opinions on whatever video they're commenting on. Most of the time, the only answer I have to this is a simple no, because I'm not a reviewer anymore. But with that said, while I don't take my opinions on media seriously anymore, I do take the media I consume seriously, and if there's one pattern on my channel when it comes to the two biggest video game series that I consider to be special to me, the Ultimate Ninja and the Yakuza series, they both received their big long videos. However, there's a new member of the special squad of video game series, and that member is called Blue Reflection. After some time, I realized that I wouldn't be able to move on without recording my feelings on this series, especially because I feel like I've come to interpret this series through the lens that goes beyond the superficial themes of these games. Now, out of these two games, the one that left the biggest impact on me was the second. However, the first one is just as important for piecing together the journey, especially because in the end, what I've come to realize is that both characters feel like different sides of the same coin, and that coin ultimately revolves around one of humanity's most haunting ghosts, that being existential crisis. To start off with the first game, Hinako was an accomplished and talented ballet dancer. Much of her identity revolved around her career as a dancer and had set up expectations for her future endeavors based around this path. Her prestigious status consumed much of her life, so much so that it felt like she no longer had anything else to live for when she suffered a tragic leg injury that made it impossible for her to continue to dance. This was a major turn of events for her simply because she now needed to coexist among normal high schoolers, and by that point she was so detached from the normal life of a high schooler that she felt isolated as a result of it. Back when she was a dancer, she had no friends, partially because they resented her for setting up unreasonable expectations for their talent and the amount of attention she received as a result of her skills. But even if they were willing to be amicable with her, she was so absorbed in her quest to improve as a ballet dancer that she never even had the chance to even initiate any friendship with anyone. It was this level of isolation that led to her dealing with depression and drowning in existential thoughts. This was until she met Lime and Yuzu and became a reflector. She was assured that if they were able to defeat the Sephora, she would be able to cure her injury as a wish, but this also meant that she now had the opportunity to establish bonds with other people, something she had never learned how to do prior to this. You see, the premise of the whole series revolves around personifying emotions, whether it's through emotional turmoil being represented as fragment referency, demons found in the common being embodiments of inner demons, and ether fragments being physical representation of powerful emotions. The first game is very simple by its nature. They use simple language to communicate the concept of emotions. Beneath the world that we're familiar with, there is also something called the Common, a spiritual dimension that serves as almost a collective consciousness that is the host of all human emotions. Whenever characters go through a rampage, their ether fragments are spread throughout the Common, which could be residing in specific locations depending on which emotions they're feeling. For example, if they're angry, there's a special location for that. Same with sadness, happiness, and sometimes a combination of different emotions. Moments that would make me appreciate the fact that this took place in high school was how often we would see random background characters going on rampages for a number of reasons. Many of them I could identify as the average struggles that teenagers have to go through in the face of their lives when their emotions become angstier and more sensitive. The producer of the game once said in an interview that they based some stories present in the game off of real-life social issues in Japan, including ones that get reported in the news. I also really like the expressive and atmospheric designs of the common locations, and in terms of the combat system, I definitely think that it was at its best when they implemented the ether more liberally. To explain a bit more, at the very beginning, before the first ever boss battle, you had three options: attack, support, and ether gauge. Attack was for all of the offensive powers you had in possession, which wasn't a lot at first. Support is primarily reserved for the recovery, buff, and debuff options that range depending on the character. Then there's the ether gauge, which at the very beginning, its only real usefulness was to recover the MP points. However, once we were met with boss battles, and I believe this was deliberately designed to align with the fact that Hinako had established new bonds, which made it so charging her ether gauge, the one represented as a percentage, would serve in favor to something called overdrive, which allows you to increase the number of moves that you can make during a turn. Later down the line, overdrive got a bigger buff in which after using it up to a certain percentage of ether would unlock a team ultimate. There were three different ones depending on who was unlocking the overdrive. The ultimates were primarily useful against boss battles, especially because of how much ether would escalate during those matches. But there are other things you could use ether for, like increasing the defense, accelerating the timeline, and recovering points. Another thing to keep in mind, and this in specific is entirely exclusive to boss battles, while you're only restricted to 3 main team members, you can recruit support characters that have their own unique skills that are useful against Sephora. So to tie this back to the actual narrative, for her to become stronger, she needed to accumulate ether fragments from people that experienced rampages, which also meant getting to a point where she understood their emotions and established connections with them. I remember playing through the campaign at the beginning and thinking about how Hinako was struggling to even stay motivated to fight as a reflector, despite the importance of her role, simply because of how she felt detached from the reality she once thought of as being hers, and didn't know any other way to live. You can trace different stages of her development based on the fragments she collected. Ren being one of the first few girls she managed to stabilize her fragment, she initially had difficulties empathizing with her struggle due to how she was consulted for advice regarding Ren's crush with one of her upperclassmen and how she was trying to build up the courage to confess her feelings. But Hinako's complete lack of relatability in this situation wouldn't allow her to be helpful in any way. But through her stabilizing Rin's fragment, she was able to find something about her struggle that she could relate to, which was regarding their decision to make a tough choice. For Rin, it was confessing her feelings. For Hinako, it was quitting ballet, something that both feared and couldn't get themselves to act, and through this shared emotion, Hinako was able to provide helpful advice to Rin. For Sarasa, she was able to relate to her in the sense that both were struggling to find a reason to live. For Hinako, it was living without having ballet in her life, and for Sarasa, it was no longer having someone to aspire to be. With Kei, she learned how to experience fun by tapping into a side of her that she hadn't indulged in a very long time, which was her sense of competitiveness, and it served as one of the first few steps for her to enjoy her life as a normal teenager. Aside from growing herself, she was also able to help others based on her familiarity. Fume was a character that was regarded as a piano genius, and due to the mounting pressure that came from the high expectations others had set up for her career as a pianist, she was experiencing a slump, something that Hinako could very much identify with based on her experience as being a talented ballet dancer, and was able to give viable advice based on that. It was the same with Rika and Kaori when it came to coping with the fact that the people you admire and look up to weren't always as ideal as the image you had created of them. One of the stranger ones was Yuri, a prodigy student that despite going through a rampage, when it came to stabilizing her fragment, not only could they not find it, but they were also not summoned to any particular area that would represent the emotion that she was feeling. Instead, they were at the center of the common, with no demons to fight against. This directly ties to a neurological condition that she has. You see, Youre was diagnosed with something called Savant syndrome. It tends to have a strong correlation with autism in terms of common symptoms. Although Savant syndrome is specifically tied to people with mental disabilities having astronomical skills in areas such as memory, calculation, art, and others. Yuri was diagnosed with this condition at a very early age, and her family sent her to a specialized school for gifted children, which allowed her to learn how to integrate socially to the extent that she can right now. But she's still far behind in terms of her development of social skills, to the point where she's unable to go to the convenience store even when she's starving. Her not having any fragments lost in the common initially gave the impression that she simply didn't have any emotions. However, Hinako helped her in recognizing her innate human emotions such as the feelings of hope, fear, and sadness when she considered the idea of her having human emotions, and through her recognizing it, she was able to unlock her fragment. It's interesting how the same person who at the beginning of the game was socially maladjusted and didn't even know how to use something as basic as a smartphone to interact with people was now in a position where she befriended and helped someone with a cognitive condition in learning how to socialize and recognizing her emotions. Although over the course of the game, out of all of the girls she met, I think the one that stood out the most was Mao, because she may have been the person that gave the biggest buff in their power levels ever since collecting her fragment, and I think this can be somewhat correlated to two things. For one, even confirmed by Hinako herself, Mao is the one she had the most difficulties understanding because of how twisted her mind is. But I also think it's somewhat in character for her to give her the biggest power up. Mao is an instigator. She manipulates others into committing, in many instances, heinous actions, and this is done, at least to her according, as a way to create social balance in the school environment that she's in. I would consider her ideology to be very similar to that of organized crime. Instead of letting the problematic people take out her inner demons in ways that create social discord, she instead manipulating them into relishing in their inner demons in concentrated and selected situations that she orchestrated and would result in the least amount of social chaos. chaos, like enabling someone who had psychological and stress-induced impulse to steal, and framing someone else who had low enough self-esteem that she was incapable of defending herself. Someone like this not only had strong convictions, but she also had an unrivaled talent in controlling people's emotions, and someone like this joining Hinako's party I think makes a lot of sense in terms of amping up their power levels, including their appearance. With that said, the game also grants you opportunities to collect more fragments from your friends by inviting them to hang out, which also increases their affinity points, and doing so can unlock sub-stories with them and reward you with a few additional fragments that can be added and customized into the main party. There are even ways to enhance the stats of the fragments by crafting items inside the comet and using them to boost the stats. However, where things started to hit me and where I caught a glimpse at the true skill of the series was when the first ever Sephiroth showed up. We changed from fighting smaller scale demons to enormous beings with borderline Lovecraftian aesthetics. Out of the four main Sephiroth, the first one will always be the most impactful to me, and the music that plays in the background is eternally special, not just because it's a good song, but also because I now identified this song with two different states of emotions that Hinako was, both correlated to the same feeling she was having. As far as what I mean by that, later down the line, Hinako found out that the promise she was given that her injured leg would be cured was a fabricated lie meant to motivate her to fight as a reflector. And while she was initially upset by this reveal, her eventual coming to grips with this marked a new stage of her development as a character. What I'm showing to you right now is the title screen of the game, very simplistic in design and only has an image of Hinako's avatar. Now I'm going to show you the title screen that shows up right around the end. As you can see, it's more populated. By that point, she had established enough relationships with other people, learned how to empathize and establish bonds with others, so much so that she was able to have a strong enough of a social life to fight beyond her wish to recover her leg. And around the second half of the game, the same four Sephiroth returned even stronger, and the last one we confronted was the very first one we met. Once we got to that point, another revelation was made, which was that Lime and Yuzu were walking ghosts, and that after they served their duty in fighting the Sephiroth, they would disappear from Hinako's life. So when Hinako fought during the reunion against the first Sephiroth, she lost the motivation to fight due to how she knew she was never going to meet Lime and Yuzu after that fight. An unwillingness to act that was similar to how she felt when she was struggling with self-identity issues, if not on a stronger scale. And now all of a sudden she was back to zero and struggling to find motivation to take action. You know, out of all the matches, the ones against the Sephiroth were always my favorites. They always had the best music, there was so much intensity in the visuals with the dark skies and intense clouds. I especially enjoyed the reunions because unlike during the first encounter in which there were two phases with each one playing their own music, their second encounter would have a third phase with a new song and brand new camera angles because of how the opponents would approximate towards us even further. You can see the main characters staring at the Sephiroth more closely and even tilting their heads up because of their enormous size. But another thing that made these matches so iconic was just how it felt like a culmination of everything you had built up until that point, and there was a lot of team effort put into it. Hinako's entire journey further proved something that was going to be made very clear by the end of the game, which was that the Kamen's biggest strength and weakness were human emotions. The same force that allowed them to combat the Sephiroth was the same one that was inevitably going to doom them due to how complicated and fragile they are. At the end of the game, we were met with some end of Eva shit in which we met Dath, the embodiment of the Kamen, a legendary figure who championed against other Sephiroth, a group of intelligent beings that fight against each other in every million years. Dath was able to be the victor by using the power of human emotions, but back when he secured his victory, there weren't as many humans as there are today, and as the population grew, the more their bonds weakened, which is what ultimately made Dath decide to unite all humans as a solution to strengthening their emotions, instead of allowing them to have individuality, which is what made their bonds deteriorate to begin with. You may have heard me refer to these creatures as Sephiroth. What's interesting is that this term is based on Jewish mysticism. Sephiroth is a term that refers to the 10 emanations or attributes through which God manifests. Out of the 10 Sephiroth in Kabbalah, 5 of them are depicted in blue reflection. The first we ever meet in the game is called Yesod, which represents foundation. When looking at the 10 emanations, they are traditionally depicted using this graph. At the very bottom we have Malkuth, which you can think of as representing the final revelation of God in terms of how it's communicated and related to the physical world. Before Malkuth we have Yesod, which is regarded as the base vehicle that allows the 10 Sephiroth to flow and channel them through Malkuth. It being the first ever Sephiroth we fought in the game and our first impression of what to expect of them is fitting when you consider how Yesod is meant to be the foundation. However, our final opponent, that being Dath, is also based on one of the 10 Sephiroth in Kabbalah, and it is where all emanations are united into one. Think of it as a location where the 10 Sephiroth exist as one infinite state of sharing. This characteristic can also be tied back to the character in Blue Reflection, who similarly wanted to unite all humans into one. It is here where we started diving deeper into more abstract concepts, and things will only get more unsettling once we get to the second game. You know, this part of the video was initially not planned to be included. When I first wrote the script for this video, I primarily intended to focus on the two game titles, but I've always been aware that there was an anime series that came out between the two game releases. I had delayed the series indefinitely just because I never felt like I needed to address it due to how they're separate creative visions. But while I was working and listening to different soundtracks from the games to know how to integrate them during the editing process, I came across this song from the anime series. This was when I realized I needed to watch it. You know, at the end of the last game, when Dath offered to unite all humans into one, Hinako refused the offer, arguing that every human's individuality was worth protecting, and through her combining the power of all of the bonds she had strengthened up until that point, she was able to prove that humans fighting as a collective were still strong enough to face gods. However, the undeniable truth is that before humans can even fight gods, they still have to fight amongst each other, and that's what makes the anime series very distinct from the games. Instead of demons and Sephiroth, the enemies here are other reflectors. Before watching this, I was somewhat aware of who was to be expected, and that's because I watched the first 3 episodes. Afterwards, I put the series on hold because I decided to give the second game more priority, even though I knew this was its predecessor. However, I don't really regret this decision, especially because a lot of what made the second game very interesting to me was the fact that it had elements of mystery. The fact that I didn't know what was going on, and if me watching the anime series opened the possibility that I would figure out things about the second game, which granted, looking back, it was pretty minute, but I still wanted to preserve my experience, even though I do acknowledge that I did miss out on a few things, like the fact that I wasn't able to accompany Uta's growth in the way that she was meant to, with how in the anime series she showed a noticeable fascination with flowers, something that was also represented as the shape of human fragments that she would try to take away from other people in a dark place in their lives, due to how pain and despair was the only way she was able to connect with other people, as things like bonds and friendships weren't feelings that she was capable of understand or emit. However, through playing the second game, we're able to learn that before she was in the mentally ill state that she is right now, she had shown fascination for flowers when she was much younger, something that her grandma was happy to figure it out. Despite the amount of times that Uta would visit her grandmother, she was never able to show any affection towards her. But when her grandmother saw glimpses of affinity towards flowers that Uta may have, she took the time to develop a beautiful garden of sunflowers, something that Uta would only find out after visiting her house roughly after her grandmother passed away. She couldn't understand at the time why her grandma put so much effort into developing the garden, but now she can look back and understand that that was a way for her grandma to connect and show affection for her. However, regardless of which I started off with, it doesn't matter at this point because ultimately I have a clearer picture of the whole universe. Blue Reflection Ray is by far the darkest entry in this franchise. Apart from addressing more misanthropic ideas, it's also not as shy when it comes to depicting dark events. Now before I proceed, there is something I will need to clarify regarding the lore. So if you happen to have finished the first game, there are some lines that imply that Hinako was the one and only chosen reflector. However, for the rest of this video, let's just look the other way and silently throw it to the wayside. As yes, there are indeed other reflectors, and we can have multiple ones per era. Now, when Hinako defeated all the Sephora, it caused the timeline to be reset, and in this new one, there are presumably more reflectors, no Sephora to fight against, as far as I can tell, and the common seems to be completely closed off. No one can access it, including reflectors, although it does seem like people can still experience fragment rampages. Another major effect this seems to have had is that some people have scattered memories from the previous timeline. For example, Mio used to be a reflector during the original timeline alongside Momo. They were doing practically the same thing Hinako and her gang was doing, just in a different area. They died in the previous timeline, and after the reset, Momo didn't initially remember those events, which resulted in her feeling like there was always something missing from her. Out of all of the reflectors, she was the only one that didn't feel comfortable using her sword, opting to use her fist instead as her own preferential way of fighting. It was only until she was able to meet Mio, someone that rekindled all the memories of them fighting together. In this series, there is a phenomenon in which two reflectors can resonate with each other and share their inner emotions. Nina was someone who initially resonated with Uta, a person that is very likely diagnosed with something called alexithymia. Shout out to this Reddit post. It's basically a condition that makes the user unable to identify or even describe the emotions that they have, which can often give them the impression of them being unempathetic. This possible condition made it difficult for Uta to stay in touch with herself and others on a human level, until at one point she experienced an accident which resulted in a scar on her leg. That pain she felt was the one proof she had that she was alive, which resulted in her developing masochistic thoughts, but also the desire to see the same pain in others. Nina, feeling underwhelmed by the perceived shallowness, inspired her to want to resonate with her leader, Mio, someone who was able to offer salvation to her at a point in time when she had fallen downhill, as a result of the parental abuse she faced as a child, later loss of her mother due to a homicide, and finally after she was able to obtain a more peaceful life with a new roommate that she could now consider a friend. That same person fell victim to a conspiratory assassination, and as she was about to kill the person responsible for that, Mio came along to offer a new path. Instead of sinking further into the pitfalls of her forsaken life, she could now participate in a bigger mission, a larger cause. Mio being the one that saved her, Nina was encouraged to want to resonate with someone she looked up to, and through her acceptance, she did. Yet even after this ritual, Nina was still unrivaled to someone like Momo, as after she was able to revisit her experience that she had with Mio in a separate timeline, she was finally able to lift the sword that she once swung alongside her partner, and during her confrontation with Nina, it eventually became a mismatch, highlighting the strength of their partnership before this timeline. While this was happening, Mio managed to retain the memories of her previous life for a while. So what does this mean? Well, it basically means that now we have a story of someone who was tasked to save the lives of various girls in Japan, many of them experiencing abuse, self-harm, mental problems, suicidal thoughts, and all sorts of torments before they eventually meet their end. However, having to restart their lives meant that they were going to experience those exact troubles again. The two breaking points in her life was firstly, not being able to save someone who was in desperate need of being rescued from a dreadful life and failing to do so before she ended her life. It showed that just simply stabilizing someone's ether fragment wasn't enough to save someone from despair. The second breaking point was when she watched her own sister, someone who she had taken care of for years after both of them were abandoned by their mother. Despite Hiyori doing her best to put up a positive attitude, it was apparent with careful observation that she was not at a healthy place mentally, and struggling to stand firm while she hoped for her mother to come back. Afterwards, Mio sent Hiyori to a separate school, which would allow her to be able to create a more independent life for herself, but in the end, her abandonment trauma caused her to go on a rampage and ultimately collapse at her sight. Not being able to save everyone's lives, including her own sister, made her take on a darker path. You see, we all have one chance at life on this earth, and that typically means that you can set your heart to believe in a brighter future for humanity after facing all of the hurdles and setbacks. However, it's a different story when you see history repeating itself even after it had its chance to start over. The main character of this series is called Hiyori, someone whom we will eventually meet again, was an altruistic person who would impulsively help the people around her, and she believed in the idea of preserving the feelings and emotions of each individual person, which was in contrast to the ideas of the antagonists of the series. Back in the first game, Lime had this habit of scouting for students who would likely go on a rampage in order to later collect their ether fragments, even if it meant her playing a small role in making that happen. Now, she was called out for this, although in her defense, they were up against an imminent threat to humanity, and also, what the antagonists were doing in this series was a lot worse. You see, in earlier days, collecting ether fragments wasn't something that had a big effect on the girls in questions. It was really just a way to power up the reflectors. However, in Blue Reflection Ray, we were met with a new concept of straight up taking away people's emotions. The series dives into the philosophical debate of whether or not humans would be better off straying to their emotions or purged from them. Many of the girls who had their emotions ripped weren't even ones that had them taken away by first. Some of them were convinced as a result of living miserable lives and no longer wanted to be sensitive to those harsh emotions. However, as a result of this, while they were still alive and functionable, they felt more like zombies. Their hearts and memories were hollow, not even being able to recognize why they wanted their emotions taken away from them to begin with. The main villain of the series is called Shino, someone who was cursed to live a nightmarish childhood alongside her twin sister, as both of them grew up in a borderline cultist environment with an abusive mother who would repeatedly assault her sister as punishment for bad deeds. As a result, her entire life felt like she was constrained, as if she had nowhere else to go besides abiding to the horrific standards of living that she was experiencing. She reached a turning point when she witnessed her sister physically castrated, and despite her attempt at running away, she couldn't find salvation because the only choice she was given was to put up with the abuse. And so to her, it was either continuing to live or commit suicide, to which she chose the latter. Until the world was later reset, and now a new path was open to her. Her main goal in this series was to open up the commons so that she would be able to have access and control of the emotions of all of humanity, not just for the sake of relieving them of painful emotions, but also to prevent them from generating conflicts in society. I think this series ties in very well with the first game in the sense that Blue Reflection showed us the power that humans have when they're able to bond with each other and use those connections to fight divine threats. However, this anime series only illustrates what Death meant when he said that humans are fragile. It's a response to the next stage of our quest of evolving society, so the real question was whether purging our emotions or strengthening them was the right solution. This was important, especially because we needed to be prepared as our next battle would be at a much bigger scale than before. Now, to continue with this analysis, I now need to bring attention to Ao from the second game, but before I do that, I might as well share some of my thoughts on how I think the second game improved from the first one. For one, I think the quality of the animation is generally better. Second, Light puts a lot of effort in increasing the number of facial and body expressions. Even the cinematography receives some quality of life changes, which although makes the campaign better, where I think this has the biggest impact on are the sub-stories, mainly because most of them aren't voice acted, so for them to have more lively imagery helps in keeping me engaged. The other reason for why it would be more important in this game over the first one also has to do with the fact that in general, the setting of the game is smaller. Aside from the hardscapes, the main location where everything takes place is a single school. The overall school is actually smaller than the one in the first game, and also the fact that previously you could hang out with other characters in other locations even if those places were limited to in-game dialogue and no actual open world exploration. But it wasn't just the animation that changed, it's also the music. Now, whether or not the quality of the music changed is arguable, especially when they share some of the same tracks, but what is an improvement is the fact that there are more songs that play during the sub-stories, unlike in the first game where you would mostly listen to I Sun, which is the same song that plays throughout the majority of the game when you explore the school setting. You as a player have a bit more agency in the decisions that Ao makes during those interactions. The choices you make aren't too important in the grand scheme of things, but knowing that you'll have to make a choice for what Ao says, which can sometimes devolve into some amusing dialogue, is something that can help you keep you gripped during those interactions. Overall, the sub-stories were a warm welcome to this game. They were very good at more or less accompanying the events of the stories, so they never felt too far off, but in terms of tone, they offered a bit of relief from the main story and gave us some slice of life moments with the characters, which fits my niche just right. One type of sub-story of the game that always brought a smile to my face were ones that were separate from the dates. Instead, they were scattered throughout the campaign, in which you would go to a certain location that would play a cutscene featuring 2 or more characters, would eventually make Ao pick one of many choices, and whichever she picked would end up boosting the stats of the character in question that you showed preference for. Now, what I like about these sub-stories is just how random they are. You could be following the flow of either the main story, or even while you're on a quest of going on dates with specific characters and maximizing your affinity with them, then suddenly you're met with a cutscene that was fully voice acted, in which they're arguing about how to categorize the bookshelves. However, it's not just the funny moments that stand out. A good example of what I mean by sub-stories doing a really good job of accompanying the main story is one involving Yuki, a character that from the very beginning came off as a very free-spirited person, the definition of an energetic and playful girl, which was the image we had of her up until we found out during Rena's Hardscape that before the Oasis, during their real lives, she was in a critical condition as a result of the ash pandemic that was infecting the world. She was one of the biggest victims of this, as she was constantly hospitalized. Finding out about this put her in a different perspective, as we watch a sub-story of her with Ao playing a simple sport, and as she was getting tired, Ao couldn't help but feel concerned about her physical state, and it only got worse when she eventually passed out. As they were in the infirmary room, they were able to have a conversation in which Yuki expressed how due to her critical health, she felt the need to live her life to the fullest, as she was constantly considering the idea that her time on Earth won't last for very long. Knowing what we end up learning later on, this scene has an entirely different meaning now. Some of the RPG elements of the game were also improved, in the sense that now you have the option to build facilities in the school setting, which can not only have their fair share of effects to boost your stats, but it can also give rise to new sub-stories. Characters also have more diverse positions. In the first game, each character would typically be placed in the same location whenever you try looking for them, but in this one, you can often see them walking through the school's building, doing a bunch of menial chores, and laying low in some of the constructed facilities. The hardscapes are also much better than the common, largely because they have more complex mapping schemes and more variety in the mechanics. For example, some spots require you to crawl, climb, slide, push certain rocks, and even change the structure of the map. Probably my favorite one was the very last hardscape that was so complex in its design that you could easily get lost and needed to make sure to change the structure of the gears in order to gain access to certain spots. This was a major improvement from the much simpler exploration present in the first game, which isn't just a big achievement within the series, but even to some degree compared to a lot of anime style JRPGs. You also have stealth, which isn't too relevant when you're looking around the hardscapes normally, but there are some side missions that are based on stealth, which is just another addition to the game's depth. In terms of the combat system, it is very different from the first game. Characters don't start off with the transformed states, which usually also limits the number of their attacks, although after a certain point in the game, it doesn't take that long for the characters to eventually transform. Ether works very differently now. It doesn't have the same reflector percentage like in the first game. It seems to be merged with the turn and MP system, in which how much ether determines how many attacks and also how many turns you can do. It's a bit hard for me to show preference for either of them just because I see them as their own thing. For example, the first game operates more similarly to a traditional turn-based system in which each character has their turn after a certain time and is granted the liberty to make a choice without being interrupted. But it also means that the game can't progress without the player taking action. Meanwhile, in Second Light, the way it works is that you need a minimum of 1,000 points in order to make a move, as that is the amount that the smallest attacks typically cost. However, just because you've accumulated that amount doesn't necessarily mean that you need to take action with that character. You have every bit of freedom to just stall or even just pick a different character to play in case they have enough ether. This system is designed to encourage more combo-based tactics, as it gives you the opportunity to have two characters aim towards the same opponent simultaneously when possible, and it also means that you can create a sequence of attacks when you allow your character to accumulate enough ether and can launch multiple moves consecutively. However, there are some restrictions. For example, at the beginning, characters will usually cap at 1,000 or 2,000 points, and how much they can accumulate depends on how many times they've taken action in the match. The other problem is that sometimes your attacks can be interrupted, especially doing strong attacks during boss encounters. There's also nothing stopping the opponents from attacking you when you're not doing anything, so it's not a system that encourages static gameplay. Like I said before, almost feels like two completely different games. But I will say that one thing I do prefer from the second game is the fact that it makes more clear if your attacks have any weakness or resist effects on the opponents. In the first game, you had to memorize which demons were weak or resistant to which attacks because you would only find out when they were already being attacked, which isn't necessarily a big deal if you're the type of person who would either quickly memorize them or if you spend enough time reading the database that you gain intimate knowledge on the demons. But at least for me, in general, it's preferable when they just tell me up front because I tend to be more considerate and decisive when I'm reminded from the get-go. Additionally, the first game, even at its hardest difficulty, wasn't that much of a challenge and never hard pressed me enough to take into account the weaknesses and resistances whenever I fought my opponents. I would whenever it was easy to catch up, but I never felt like it was a necessity, especially because the game's damage scale always confused me. I've never confirmed this with other players, so I may be in the minority here, but at least in my experience, I've noticed that sometimes attacks that require less MP did more damage than more expensive attacks. I've never been able to figure out why. At first I thought it was maybe because of the weakness and resist properties. I recently decided to revisit some of the random encounters once again, and I was able to confirm, at least with some demons, the additional damage did come largely from the weakness effects, but for many others that I've experienced, I was never able to find any correlation. The only explanation I can think of is that perhaps the MP cost is proportional to the stats of the demons, because I did notice that stronger opponents, especially the Sephira, had their damage dealt mostly consistent with the MP cost, so I'm more inclined to believe this was the cause. If anyone has any explanation for this, I would appreciate your feedback. Regardless, stats in the second game seem to be more comprehensive, and the difficulty curve is also higher than the first game. It's still not that hard, but I did feel like it was more challenging, so I do appreciate that because that was one of my biggest pet peeves with the first game. You're also no longer limited to 3 party members. While it's still a team of 3, you have several characters to pick from, and you can even swap one of the main members with the support member during matches. Lastly, during boss battles, there is this one-on-one type of game that pops out during the matches. This can be either a good or bad thing, as when you're able to play your cards right and perfect the dodges and counters, it can be a very beneficial way of speeding up the fight by inflicting more damage than usual. However, the opposite is also true. If you're reckless, it can be an easy and quick road for either losing a lot of help from one of your teammates or just straight up lose them for the rest of the match. Reason why it matters here more than usual is because in my experience, this was the part of the game where I experienced the most misinputs. Now, in my last video, I mentioned that Blue Reflection Second Light was a perfect combination of simple and abstract concepts, so I think I might as well explain a bit further what I meant by that. It's going to require some context to understand why that is the case, because in reality, these games seem to dive deep into 2 separate themes that represent 2 extremes of the same train of thought. Looking back, Hinako and Ao, the 2 protagonists of both games, contrast each other, specifically in regards to their humble beginnings. Before I ever played Blue Reflection Second Light, I was aware that we would be greeted with new characters, but eventually I realized that Hinako would come back, which made me very happy because I had spent so many hours following her journey that it would be very difficult for me to play a sequel game without her. So even if all she did was play a smaller role than what she did before, that was honestly enough to keep some semblance of familiarity. In fact, I still remember when she first got referenced in the game during Shiho's Heartscape. It was honestly one of the most tightening moments for me because of how slowly the revelation was delivered. It was obvious that it was her for anyone who played the first game, but for the game to present her in such a vague and mysterious way during someone else's memory fragments, while they steadily drop minor details that make it very clear that it's her, I was constantly at the edge of my seat waiting for her to eventually show up, and when she did, it felt very satisfying. It's also inspiring how, even after her memories were temporarily gone, she still held on to Lime and Yuzu despite the fact that they were supposed to have disappeared from the first game. Hinako seems like a more well-rounded person in this game, showing how much she had changed since the previous campaign when she was severely depressed. I actually really like the way they went about connecting the 2 games. Second Light is a clear direct sequel to the first game, but it still gives you enough room to be experienced as its own self-contained story. It starts off with a cast of 4 new characters in which we quickly got a very good glimpse at their personalities and how they interact with each other. As a newcomer, you get introduced into the world as if it were a new IP. but over the course of the game, they start to slowly integrate elements of the first game, such as the appearance of Yuzu, later Hinako, and because it's all presented like a mystery being unveiled, you won't easily feel lost as a first timer. However, as a long-time player, I feel a sense of relief seeing familiar concepts and characters slowly becoming more relevant to the plot. This can even extend to the anime series. It feels like a big relief seeing Hiyori and Mio having a more sisterly relationship and also feeling like they had grown since the last events. To me, it was even more satisfying seeing how Hiyori was taking on a more protective role, as Mio didn't retain her reflective powers and Hiyori was more than ready to take the initiative in battle, which does show a huge growth from her frailer attitude she had in the anime when compared to his sister. An example of this is when the team was exploring their hardscape, and once they were able to find Mio lying around, they headed towards her and were met with a demon. That was the moment when Hiyori unleashed her dual wield stand, something that we hadn't seen before, and it was pretty awesome. Now, to bring back the point I had made about Hinako and Ao contrasting each other, while Hinako was very talented, Ao was the exact opposite. Throughout her life, she lived a boring, ordinary, and introverted lifestyle, in which she never felt like she had accomplished anything or living her life to the fullest, which is why she envied the heroes that she followed on the anime and manga that she read. However, both share one similarity, in which becoming reflectors gave them a second chance to turn their life around. With Hinako, it was recovering her leg. For Ao, it was becoming the leader of a group of reflectors. Now, with all that said, even from the very beginning, I was always committed to following Ao for the long run. She had a bright personality and was prone to being initiative, one that allowed her to fit very well into the hero's archetype. She's also someone who I feel like most players would find to be relatable due to how she was an otaku and based on her backstories, lived a pretty likely reclusive life up until she was summoned to this new world. So she was also identifiable and even on some level inspiring by her nature, which is why I wasn't surprised that I ended up taking a liking to her throughout the campaign. Now, what I didn't predict was that by the end, she would end up becoming one of my favorite protagonists of all time. This was a realization I eventually made the second I finished the game, and reflected on the whole campaign. When I look at some of my favorite stories, I notice that a lot of them tend to have one thing in common, and that is an element of mystery. Blue Reflection Second Life was a game that was engulfed in mystery throughout its story, and I think of all the characters, by far the most mysterious one was the main protagonist, Ao. The entire basis of the plot at the beginning was the idea that she was the only one out of the four main members of the group that had her memories intact, while everyone else had their memories completely wiped, and it was through them exploring their hardscapes that they were able to regain some of their memories. Kokoro's hardscape will remain an iconic one because of the feeling of unease that is present in the atmosphere. The music especially had many instances where we would hear glitching noises. For the record, I highly recommend you listening with earphones as you will more easily capture some of the sound effects there. Perhaps the eeriest part of the song is somewhere around the middle where we start hearing what seemed like sounds of a woman reading a message from a teleprompter. The reason why this part is so eerie is due to how the sound itself is reminiscent of what are typically very public environments like airports or shopping centers. And yet this couldn't be further from what we were seeing with our own eyes. This was a setting where only 4 girls could be found. It was a deserted and stranded location with zero connection to the real world. No sign of human population beyond their group, and no one knew what got them there. So for us to be roaming around in this location, especially back at the beginning when they initially weren't even aware that it was Kokoro's hardscape, with all of the strange creatures and at times glitching objects, it made for a very creepy environment to roam around. Another favorite of mine is Uta's hardscape, especially during our first run, as it was very different from what we had perceived prior to this. Being the inside of a psychotic heart, it was hard to decipher the meaning behind the creative choices. The ambient music that played in the background, even proving to sound more refreshing than those of characters with more peaceful minds, the strange interactions with the memory fragments as the black silhouettes would often stare and talk to us despite being meant to depict past memories. But as they further explored their individual hardscapes, the more they came to realize that their lives were interconnected in some way or another. The thing that they all shared in common was the fact that they do remember the ash pandemic that was spreading and posing a danger to a large number of the population. But Ao was the only character who had no memories of this. In fact, all she remembered was experiencing the most ordinary life that anyone could have, which almost in a way puts her in the same position as us the players. She originates from a regular life, much like us the audience, which made her more grounded to us, but it also made her more detached from the world she's inhabiting. However, despite the tendency for the characters to remain simple in human understanding and communicating their emotions, the world around them would progressively turn out to be more abstract. Unlike in the first game, in which characters had to collect ether fragments that were lurking somewhere in the common, which was split between different locations based on the emotions they were feeling, in the second game, we had to collect fragments located on separate hardscapes. What was fascinating about each hardscape is that they were the characters and our own solution for understanding the emotional depth behind a person. This is how we would come to learn more about the person's past, but nothing was ever depicted in a transparent way. The locations we would visit were always imaginative and fantastical, and whenever we would collect the memory fragments, we would only see black silhouettes. Even for a character like Hinako, someone who we had enough material for showing fully fleshed cutscenes with more realized settings and expressions, her hardscape was depicted in the exact same abstract manner. But amongst all of the members of the main cast, there was one character that had a differently designed hardscape, and that of course was Ao. Hers looked about as realistic as it could. In fact, out of all of the hardscapes I visited, she was by far the one I spent the most time observing every single corner of it. There were no demons, so I never needed to worry about random encounters, and it was surprisingly not as restrictive with invisible walls. Obviously, it still had plenty of them, but there were some apartments in which I was a bit surprised by how much liberty they gave in entering their yards, even if it was just for a few meters. There were also posters of real-life people, which felt reminiscent to some of the hangout locations in the first game. Overall, it was ironically its normalcy that made it the creepiest out of all the hardscapes, further enhanced by the fact that visiting the place didn't leave us any closer to finding the connection between her and everyone else. It really did feel like she came from a completely different world, and one that was no different from ours. That was, of course, until we saw the elephant in the room.
いや、あれを見て。あれ、何？
Something that contributed to me being constantly invested in trying to understand her character had to do with the concept of the system. At around the middle of the game, we started to get introduced to more divine concepts that seemed to be at play, or at least that's how it would be interpreted through the human mind, because they were repeatedly presented as something that was beyond human comprehension. You see, we learned that there was a system, one that functioned based on the standard that was at play of the Sephira fighting each other every million years in order to figure out who would rule as the overseer of the universe. But due to all the Sephira being defeated at the end of the first game, this caused an instability in the universe, which resulted in a course correction in the form of the Ash, a worldwide pandemic that was meant to eliminate the entire universe and reset it all to zero. For a while, I had begun to predict that Ao was somehow connected to the system. I just didn't know how. Although despite the amount of excitement it brought to me, it didn't compare to the amount of anxiety it brought to Ao. Due to the very nature of her character, she was the type of person that would stay sharp and high-spirited, and it's to the point where it's sometimes hard to remember how scared she was deep down. Not knowing who you are is scary enough when you don't have any memories of your past, but it can be equally as scary when it feels like your memories don't reflect the reality that you're living. While everyone is slowly rediscovering themselves, Ao keeps further distancing herself from understanding who she really is. However, what may have been more terrifying to her than this was also knowing what would happen to them afterwards, because after a certain point, all of the girls had to confront the truth that their entire homes, friends, and relatives were gone. They were wiped out by the Ash, and for the time being, that island they were living in was the only world they had left, one that was doomed to be destroyed after a certain point. For them to be able to act and stay motivated in this situation, they needed to believe that they had the chance for them to return to their lives. And I think Ao did a really good job at lifting their spirits, not just in terms of motivating them via speech, but also through her actions. Just so you can understand, at one point, in order to understand the exact details of the system, a drastic decision needed to be made. Remember what I said earlier regarding the common being a collection of all of humanity's thoughts and emotions? When it was confirmed that Ao wasn't even registered anywhere in the common, this was when Lime and Yusa suspected that she may be connected to the system in some way. She wasn't the only one. Uta was also strongly hinted to have been in contact with the system in some way, For them to understand the system, they had to pick between exploring Uta or Ao's Heartscape. Now, both plans had their major flaws. In the case of Uta, the biggest problem had to do with the fact that the last time they tried exploring her Heartscape was disastrous and led to the Oasis suffering major damage. With Ao, the main issue had to do with the fact that since by that point she hadn't unlocked her Heartscape, it was very likely that she wouldn't be able to do it under normal circumstances. So what they needed to do was extract her fragment manually, which was very dangerous. There was a serious chance that she would die as a result of it. However, she didn't hesitate to pick that option to extract her fragment, simply due to the fact that risking her life is much safer than risking everyone's life by putting Oasis in danger again. Additionally, even after finding a way to return to their homes once again, there was never any guarantee that they would be able to reunite due to their memories possibly being altered. And even if that wasn't a factor, there was almost no guarantee that Ao would reunite with them, given how at that point it was conclusively proved that they weren't from the same timeline.
オリジンに思いを届けて作る世界。それはあの子たちが望む元の場所に似た世界。そしてそれは同時にあなたがいた世界でもある。あなたはこれから作り出される未来から来たんだよ。生まれ直したあなたはあなたが知っている通りの人生を送る。普通に生まれて普通に成長して普通に学生になって、そしてまた雫世界にやってきて世界を作り直し、すべてを忘れて生まれ直す、その繰り返し。
You know, when the crew ultimately decided to recreate the world, they initially failed because their feelings of uncertainty were interfering with the entire procedure. Because of this, they ended up exploring what they described as a heartscape that encompassed all of the distress emotions. It was through them collecting their respective fragments that they were able to confront their insecurities and strengthen their convictions. However, the final fragment, and what proved to be the most difficult one to collect, was Ao's. Now, there are two ways that you can interpret the final boss. You could either view it as the system's last attempt at destroying the Oasis and other reflectors in order to finalize its process of resetting the world, which is a reasonable way of interpreting it. However, I think there is an alternative, rather symbolic way of interpreting the confrontation, as there's a very clear change in attitude after Ao got in contact with her fragment and had not only confronted her insecurities, but was also enlightened on the true nature of herself. One that was prophesied to be in an eternal loop of being reborn, and no matter how much she repeated these events, she would never have the chance to reunite with them again. You can also see an attitude change in the way she interacted with the other girls. The last interaction she had with them before fighting the last boss felt more like an indirect goodbye than the last encouraging words before they would eventually meet again in the next world. She even set her conviction to fight for the other girls' lives and not so much for her own, meaning that at that point she had already come to grips with the fact that her biggest fears that were keeping her from staying focused on her plan were going to come to fruition. Yet she still remained firm because ultimately who she was really fighting against that day wasn't just another demon, it was the embodiment of her insecurities. Notice how the design of the final Heartscape bears a suspicious resemblance towards a certain futuristic architecture during Ao's Heartscape. Also take into account how, with the exception of Hiyori and Mio's, plus Yuzu and Lime's Heartscapes, the other ones had a 3-stage structure, with Ao's being the one exceptional case of only having one stage. Yet, if you combine the last Heartscape, which has 2 stages, suddenly we have a 3-stage location, ending with the final boss battle. I'm just saying, regardless if this is in real terms the collective Heartscape of everyone there, I think from a symbolic viewpoint, this was truly Ao's Heartscape. That's why she was noticeably angrier and more serious during this combat. It's tragic because Ao is basically a victim of a phenomenon that will never be truly understood, as there's no way she'll be able to trace back the point in time when she became destined to be trapped in this endless loop, as her memories will continuously be reset, and the exact properties of what they describe as the system is something that isn't meant to be understood by the human mind. The only thing she can truly do is act on her ideals. It's why I describe this game as a beautiful combination of simple and abstract concepts. The abstract nature largely comes from the otherworldly figures at play, such as the Sephira, Origin, and the System, which are designed to be vague phenomenons, ones that make the characters challenge their own existence. For Hinako, it was whether or not she was willing to protect the individuality of each human being instead of uniting them in one, even if it meant continuing to allow humans to become susceptible to the fragile and conflicted emotions that leave them vulnerable to being endangered by higher threats to their lives and existence, unless they all unite as a collective. And if they couldn't unite under their own accord, their only solution would perhaps be to force them to merge as one. Dath even described how Hinako was once a weak person, and that she could still one day re-experience the anguish that she felt, which is why in that moment he wanted to lift all of that away from her. For Ao, it was whether or not she was willing to maintain the life she had built for herself in Oasis, in which she finally found meaning and purpose, had established strong relationships with her new friends, and was at that point the last breath of Earth's existence. It was either that or aim towards a future in which they would be able to return to their original lives, but it meant that she would likely never reunite with them again, and that she would never have a true future, constantly reliving her life and never moving beyond that one special summer she experienced with her friends, and yet they both pushed forward. Following the end of my journey with these games, there were two things that stayed on my mind. The first one was that I quite enjoyed the anime series. Blue Reflection Ray was initially exclusive to Funimation, but due to a recent import to Crunchyroll, I was able to watch it more easily and I was quite fond of the story. It's a shame that the Blu-ray release was cancelled because it's the one piece of Blue Reflection material that I don't own. Also, I still haven't backed down on my request for the PS5 remaster of Second Light. My wallet is more than ready, it's really just a matter of Koei and Gus making it available. Aside from this, I don't know how long this video will be, although based on the length of the script, I highly doubt it will be a short one. I know there's also a mobile game, but at least by the time I'm writing the script, it hasn't been released. Plus, it's a mobile game. I'm sure it's probably gonna have gacha elements. That's not really my field of interest. Maybe I'll watch walkthroughs of it on YouTube just to know what happens in the story. Other than that, don't expect me to pay attention to it. Besides this, I think that's all I have to comment on. Editing this will be a complete fucking nightmare, and I hope you all have a good day.